Welcome back to the Cruise Elite podcast. I'm here with Tony this morning. Tony, what's up, man?
Not a lot. I am admiring your awesome T-shirt.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's okay for people listening. He's got a Cruise Elite logo shirt. It's like a black tee with the white logo, and I can only see half of it, but I knew what it was.
Nice, that's good.
That's cool.
That's good. You know what's funny about logos? Alicia and I put so much overthinking into it for so many years because we've gone through so many different iterations of our business and different names, and finally we ended up we weren't going to settle with Cruise Elite. It was actually the name that I came up with in it was like the first generation of my coaching career, right? I used Cruise Elite, and for a lot of years we operated with that name, but we were kind of disappointed. Like, we didn't want to go with that, but we ended up going with it over the years, and it ended up working out. But we finally found like a graphic designer that did this logo up for us, and we were like, you know what? Now it's cool because it looks good.
I think it's a lot like bands, like the name in a vacuum sort of could be whatever. Like Green Day, like is that
Right.
Nirvana, like cool Nirvana. But once there's music attached, now all of a sudden it takes on meaning and it becomes something that it wasn't before. So,
right.
You grow into the name. The name is a placeholder for what you will become.
Yes. I like it.
Yeah, Cruise Elite. So yeah, man, you were just on vacation?
Yeah, it was so cool. We were up in the North Country, so 2.5 hours north of where we already are. So we live in central New Hampshire. So we went way up to the tip of New Hampshire in a town. We stayed in a town called Pittsburgh, and it's almost Canada, right? It's way up there. And we had a blast. So my neighbor has a cabin up there that sits on a pond, and it's a beautiful house. And for a number of years now, they've been asking us, hey, go use it. And, it was something that we just kind of had to put on hold when our daughter was, really young. And she's 3 now. And so this was the year to do it.
Yeah,
and we had a blast.
Sturdier, a little more independent.
Yep. And so we've been up there for the last basically 4 days. And this podcast with you is like literally the first thing I'm doing, getting back into the grind. And so it took me a long time to get out of my pajamas this morning, man. Like the last 4 days, I've been waking up at like 4 a.m. and, it was a mad dash out the door in the darkness to get to the fishing spots.
Right.
And I did a lot of fly fishing, and then we did kayaking. We did some hiking. We cooked great food. We ate s'mores. We sat in front of the campfire. It was nice.
Oh, that's awesome, man.
Yeah.
And a nice change of pace from your regular routine.
Totally.
And sitting in front of screens.
Oh, yeah. So now it's back, back to reality. We're really starting to think about getting back on Instagram and doing the social media stuff because we've got a lot coming up. So, and I guess as a reminder to our listeners, we have a free webinar coming up. It's a webinar that introduces people to applied neurology, and that comes up on August 21st. So if you want to sign up for that, you can do that using the link in the description, or in the show notes rather. You can do it right off of our website, and then we'll email you information about it. But even if you can't make the live portion of that, you can still see the replay. So definitely check that out. And then shortly after that, we go into the sales process for the Neuro Dojo. So that's kind of like a introduction. The webinar will be an introduction to the material that we cover in much greater depth come September when we begin the Neuro Dojo. So we have a lot to get back to, work with in prepping for all of that.
Yeah. Your Neuro Dojo clients, those are the ones where they'll like kind of case study with you, right? And workshop things. Like weren't you having issues with your knee or your elbow or something, and they were coming up with solutions for you?
Yeah, that was exactly. So in the Neuro Dojo, we basically go deeper into applied neurology, and we teach people how to be more targeted with the approach.
Yeah.
And we go into the brain and the different structures in the brain and how to target them with specific exercises. And we have a whole community that's attached to that. So a place where we just create dialogue and education. And yeah, you're remembering that one time where I had left knee pain after some jujitsu.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, this is a good opportunity to ask them what they would do. So we started talking about it in the community with the students. And sure enough, two things came of that with two different students who came up with some really good ideas for me. And I used the drills and solved my knee pain very, very fast. I was super pumped. It was a proud coach moment.
Nice. Nice. Well, yeah, don't miss it. August 21st.
Yep. That's right.
Free webinar.
That's right.
So yeah, man, hopefully we can ease you back into the work.
Ease me back in with this topic. This is the big one.
Yeah. Well, what we wanted to talk about today was neuroplasticity.
Yeah.
And this is something that has come up a little bit in the past. And I just thought it was a fascinating idea to think about kind of on its own and then apply it to, what we've been talking about here. So, I think the best way to start this conversation is when you hear the word neuroplasticity, what does it mean to you?
Great. So, and actually, this is extremely relevant to both the webinar that we have coming up and our Neuro Dojo course, because with the Neuro Dojo, what we're essentially doing is teaching people how to better drive plastic change with the brain. And that's in regards to exercise interventions, right? How can we use specific exercises to actually either train skill competency or even rehabilitate a system that has been disused or injured? Okay, so that's kind of what we're trying to aim for with the additional education that we provide in that course. And that deserves its own course because plasticity, which we'll kind of define here in a moment, is not so easy that you can just throw exercises at it and expect those exercises to do the job and to stick long term. And so when we talk about plasticity, we're essentially talking about the ability for your brain to change, right? So thinking about that as both structural change and functional change in terms of neurons. So we're talking about actual neurons, which are cells and nerve cells. So this idea of plasticity is a really interesting one because up until fairly recently, maybe the last 15, 20 years, it's kind of plasticity has sort of been discussed in a way that led us to believe that once you get to like a certain age, right, or once you're an adult, your brain can no longer go through these changes. In fact, it was more, the way that we were looking at it was more like, okay, once you get to a certain age, are we going to see the opposite, right? Are we going to see this kind of deterioration, this slow deterioration? But now what we're understanding with all of this new emerging research is that the brain can change, right? Through your adult lifetime, right? Things can change both structurally and functionally. And so that's really, really exciting. It's no longer like, oh, once you're 22 years old, you basically have the brain that you're going to have, and hopefully it's a good enough one that you can do the things you want to do and so forth.
Yeah, the brain is like reaches full maturity at
right
20 something. And isn't there one of the things that they would say, isn't it like different for men and women? So they'd be like, oh,
I heard that,
women like mature faster and like men take a few more years to cook, It's like they're still dummies until 23,
right. I have heard that. So now we're starting to understand, wow, this is exciting. The brain can change. We can actually see change structurally and functionally. And so that creates a lot of new questions, right? Because in the context of training and exercise, it forces us to ask these questions like, well, what does that mean then? How can we best create plastic change and drive neuroplasticity so that we can get the results that we want in both skill competency and rehabilitation? And as I was mentioning before, it's not so easy that you can just throw drills out there and expect them to stick. And that's, I think, really what kind of drove me to go down more of the applied neuro type of field, go into that field, rather than just continue to get more education on which exercises work, right? Like, here's some good exercises, right? Because that's kind of what you're faced with in the fitness slash strength and conditioning world. It's like, all right, if I'm going to continue to get more education, usually that education just kind of puts me in a place where it's like, all right, here's a new textbook for you with all these different exercises. And now, okay, let me teach you how to do them. Go use those exercises with your clients. But what I was observing and experiencing is that when I was trying to help people with learn different movement skills or rehabilitate from pain and injury, it just was never easy, right? It was always challenging, and everybody seemed unique and different. And so it forces you to ask some questions like, all right, well, everybody's different. So how do we best drive plastic change for somebody knowing that? And there's lots of different variables to consider. And when I was prepping for this podcast, I was looking at some of the slides that we actually use in the Neuro Dojo. And so I've got like maybe 8 or 9 things that, we can go through and talk about. Maybe we'll hit them all, maybe we won't, but they're all really, really important ones. And I think it will really be thought-provoking for people to think about exercise in this way. Because, if you're trying to get out of pain, right, or you're trying to rehabilitate an old injury or kind of break through a mobility limitation, anything like that, or gosh, even squash old bad habits or addictions, right? It's all relevant to this idea of plasticity and the brain.
So maybe a good place to jump in and let me know if your structure kind of covers this already.
Sure.
But when you're saying there's plasticity means, you could make a functional or a structural change in the brain.
Yeah.
If we were to tie it to a skill or a behavior, what does that look like? Like if I have never hopped on one foot before,
right,
and I'm trying to learn how to hop on one foot for the first time, how is the brain changing as I learn that? Is it changing structurally or functionally? What's the difference? Does it matter?
Right. So that's a good question. So it's, as far as I understand from what I've learned through people who are teaching me what the literature says, because I'm not the deep research guy.
Yeah.
I use other really smart people to teach me what they're learning in the research, and then I take that and try to do my best applying it with different ideas. So based on what I'm currently learning and what I have learned is that when it comes to plasticity, the structural change that takes place in the brain is going to take much longer. Right. And some of the variables that we're going to discuss today will cover some of the important things that we have to consider to create long-term structural change. What I understand, though, is that the functional change can happen extremely fast. So we're going to be going through functional changes all the time with exercise, especially in trying to learn new things. Like what you described, hopping on one leg if you've never done that before, right? So when it comes to like learning basic skills like that, it comes down to, well, things like repetition. It comes down to intensity. It comes down to even how important is it to your brain from a learning idea of, we call it salience, right? Like, like how important is this? And is your brain paying attention enough that we can kind of harness that over the long term, practice it with enough intention, the right intensity, right? For a long period of time, maybe, right? Frequency is a big one. So all of those things are super, super important when it comes to learning a new skill. So you got to practice it, right? You can't just do it once and expect it to stick. You have to go through this learning process and even invite the mistakes, right? Find those errors and correct them, right? And do that with enough intensity over time to create change.
Okay. Maybe this is too in the weeds, but is what's going on in the brain, like if you have a functional change in your neurons, right? Is it
Yeah.
that they're learning to fire differently or respond to different stimuli or, work in a different sequence? Is that kind of what we mean when something's changing in the brain? Because I guess I just want to be able
Yeah.
to like visualize, okay, I learned to brush my teeth with my left hand
Right.
and I've never done that before.
Right.
Like what's going on in there that's
Yeah.
allowing that?
Yeah, absolutely. Everything that you just said for sure, and essentially the new formation of pathways that
Okay.
are relative to those skills that you're learning. That's exactly right. But you just made me think of an important part that I want to make sure we say here towards the beginning of this episode is that this functional change that I'm after as a coach
Mm-hmm.
is not measurable,
Right.
right? So this is where it becomes really, this is the interesting part for us because I don't have a machine that I can wave over my client at this point, or we don't have an app that we can somehow plug into to say, hey, that last exercise was really good. The right neurons got activated and
Right.
they acted upon these other neurons. And all of a sudden, now we're on our way to creating better plastic change with this drill set. We don't have that technology, at least yet, right? So function becomes the best indicator of what you're actually doing.
Mm-hmm.
And so what that does for us as practitioners is it forces us to really lean on the assess reassess process that we've been talking about since day one of the podcast, where we're always constantly measuring a person's function after each either drill set or individual exercise. And this is part of the reason why I'm so fanatical with the assess reassess. Because sometimes people learn that and they're like, hey, do I really have to assess everything? Well, yeah, if you have a goal, because the immediate output, the way that the person is functioning, which is what we're looking at with the assessment, will actually give you the biggest clue as to whether you're on the right path. And anyone who has experience with that at this point will understand this because you're either going to get immediate improvements in function, whether that is, skill capacity of some kind, coordination, range of motion, strength, balance, all these different things that we look at, you will see those things change in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other side of that is that you can also see a person regress.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are using the wrong drill selection or the wrong exercise and you're not using the correct inputs, you can see the opposite. And that, when you start to look at that through this idea of plasticity, you start to go, oh boy, this is intense, because that means if I do the right things, I can create change, right? But as you start to understand plasticity better and how it's super specific, you then say to yourself, oh gosh, if I do the wrong things, my brain will also get better at that. Right. And so that's where it kind of gets a little scary, because we can actually get better at bad habits through this idea of plasticity. So you can have neuroplasticity that we consider good, right? Decreases in pain, increases in skill competency, different movements. We can also see that we can have plasticity with something we don't necessarily want to be good at, like sitting in front of a computer with poor posture, staring at, the same screen the whole time, right? So bad habits come into play here as well.
Yeah, that's great. So, given that, let's go down your list
Okay,
and
let's do it.
see what comes up.
Okay, so first one here is use it or lose it, right? We've all heard that. Guess what? It's true. Okay.
I laugh every time. I'm so
Yeah.
immature.
Yep. Uh, use it or lose it. It's the most important concept here, because when we use what we have for movement competency, right? We're activating our brain. And when we don't do that, we get better at it, right? So
Mm-hmm.
using the system is the most important factor, because if you don't use it and you don't excite your brain through movement in all of these ways that that we know we can, right? Thinking about some of these first conversations we had, I think back when we were talking about more proprioception,
Mm-hmm.
right? We have all these different sensory systems. They do different things for us. They allow us to, move through the world in a certain way. They pick up they measure different types of stimuli, right? Whether it's proprioceptive stimulus, visual stimulus, vestibular stimulus, we have to use the system to its fullest ability, or
Mm-hmm.
else we start to lose those abilities. And that is simply because your brain is an energy hog, and it's constantly trying to calculate how much energy is needed to move through the world and do the things that we want to do.
Yeah, it wants to be as efficient as possible, right?
Exactly, exactly. And so this really comes down to energy expenditure and trying to save energy. And so as your movement box shrinks, right? I know you love the movement box
Yeah.
kind of analogy. As your movement box shrinks, either accidentally over time because you're not moving in a certain way, so more of a disuse, versus maybe you've had an injury and now
Mm-hmm.
your brain is not receiving the same input that it used to.
Mm-hmm.
These things become brain issues, and your brain is just not getting the input that it needs. So there's quite a lot of blurry spots and gaps. That all kind of factors into this use it or lose it principle. And if your brain is always trying to save as much energy as possible, so it's actually a strategy,
Mm-hmm.
right? Your brain's kind of like cutting ties with certain functions if you're not using them appropriately. And that's really important to know. That's in itself, that builds the biggest case for why it's so important to have physical training
Mm-hmm.
that covers this huge gamut of possibilities in terms of stimulating the most sensory systems.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, coming from kind of more traditional fitness background, a good parallel system to think about is like your cardiovascular system and then like your muscle building apparatus, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you don't do any sort of cardio at all, you sit on the couch for 2 weeks straight, the next time you go up 3 flights of stairs,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to be breathing a lot harder, right? Your body has already decided, hey, we're not going to be as good at cardio right now because it doesn't seem like you need it.
Right.
With muscle, that's a much longer process. It takes a lot longer to build muscle and a lot longer to lose muscle, but people atrophy
Mm-hmm.
when they're on a hospital bed in a coma, for example, or when they just don't do anything with their muscles. So it's sounds to me like the brain has a similar strategy across these very different systems
That's right.
as it does with kind of this more neurosensory stuff.
That's right. And a big one too is joint health, right?
Hmm.
Just a really practical way to think about it. If you don't use your joints the way that they were designed to be used, right? We talked about having those movement options. We recently, in the last episode, I think it was, talked about the importance of joint mobility exercises, bringing your
Hmm.
joints through full ranges of motion and loading them in a variety of ways. Well, I had talked about training at different speeds, right? Being under tension for a longer period of time, maybe using band resistance, challenging all these different receptors that we have. The reason comes back to this. It comes back to keeping your body and your brain healthy, so that you can expand that movement box. I was just the other morning. I think it's all a blur at the moment. I think it was yesterday morning. I was out fishing, and I met up with a guy that I hadn't fished with in like 14 years. So the fly fishing community is kind of funny. It's like you've got all these buddies that you're like texting with all the time about fishing locations and conditions. And some of these guys, it's like you're still talking to them and doing the texting thing with them about certain locations and stuff, and you haven't fished with them in like 10 years. This guy
That's
I met,
so cool.
yeah, it's just like that, and it's like you've got your group of people, and then like there's no outsiders, right? It's like a game of poker. You're not just going to give up locations and tactics and all this stuff to anybody. So I know this great guy, and it just so happened that through a friend, I found out that he was going to be in the same area that I was in, and our trips were overlapping just by one day. And so I met him on the river yesterday morning in the darkness, and I hadn't fished with him in like 14 years. He's older. He's a little bit of an older guy, but the last time I fished with him, the dude was an animal. Like, he was running up and down the banks, helping me and my buddy net fish. He's a hardcore fly angler himself. He catches fish. He moves around the river really, really well. And this guy was always like, his name's Merrill, and this guy was always like, we always respected him a lot. We were like, man, this guy's legit. Well, I haven't fished with him in 14 years. We got on the river yesterday, and I start charging down the path, getting ready to get to the spots. And I look behind me, and I'm like, man, Merrill's moving slower than I remember. And sure enough, one of the first things he says to me is, hey, Taylor, man, my knees are trashed these days. And he's like, he was having trouble getting off the bank, getting back up onto the riverbank. We were in an area that was a little challenging for wading too, But he wasn't the same animal. And I was like, damn, this sucks. He was moving slow. He couldn't really go everywhere that I was going. And we started having conversations about it. And he's like, I really need to start doing some of your stuff and getting my joint health back. And just in 14 years, which if you think about how quick 14 years can feel when you haven't seen somebody in that time,
seriously.
It's just like, boom. Well, he's an example of joint health that had deteriorated over time accidentally through disuse. And even though he's an active guy, he just wasn't stimulating his body in all of those ways that we talk about. It was just some specific ways. And eventually your brain and your body is going to pick up on that pattern. And just through this idea of trying to be efficient, your brain literally says, guess what? I don't need these joints to work the way that they used to anymore. And why would I require that if the activation is not there? Because now you're asking to keep the brain active in a sense that's going to take energy, even though the input is not necessarily coming in. So your brain's just like, all right, knees, let's over time start taking away range of motion and capacity there because we don't need it. It's kind of scary to think about it like that.
Yeah. Especially when it's someone you know and been in touch with, and you kind of see and I think we all have versions of that. It's people we haven't seen in a long time that just changed a lot. I've seen the opposite change happen too, which is pretty cool. When someone
100%.
like takes that step into fitness that they never took before and like really
no doubt about
start
it,
thinking about it and moving that way.
I mean, that's really the big takeaway too, that I want to be, highlighting, is that it's scary to think about how the movement box can shrink, right? And how that can actually be plastic change itself. But there's no doubt about it that it can go the other way. And if we do the right things, we can really, really create change in both our brain and body.
Awesome.
So I'm scanning my list here. as I move down it, one thing that I want to hit is that specificity matters for creating change. Okay.
Yeah.
There's a big difference between generally exercising in a way to keep the system healthy, or all these
Mm-hmm.
different systems, versus targeting something very specific. So we have to understand our goals. So, for example, the way that we program our strength sessions and our mobility sessions inside the dojo is more of a general training approach.
Mm-hmm.
The goal is to give an individual as much activation as possible through exercise, right? Thinking about all those different sensory systems, including visual stimulus, vestibular stimulus, proprioceptive stimulus, changing positions, changing time under tension, using different tools, kettlebells, dumbbells, barbells, body weight, right?
Mm-hmm.
All these things that we can do, training at different speeds, okay?
Mm-hmm.
We're doing that in more of a general sense to try to give the person as much activation as possible, because that's what we need to keep the systems healthy.
Mm-hmm.
That is different than saying, I want to solve pain or a very specific mobility problem, right? We have to then start to target things in a more specific way. And that's when we're going to start to think about our tools, think about different brain areas, assess, reassess. But that's important for listeners to understand, is that a lot of this is goal dependent, especially if you want to get more targeted.
Yeah, and we just did that episode, the last episode, kind of about easy neuroscience, like things that anyone can do to kind of give their body and their systems and their mind exposure to
Yeah,
these different
that's the word.
variables. And yeah, it sounds like in the strength dojo, that's kind of your bread and butter.
That's the word,
Um,
man.
yeah,
Exposure. That's it.
yeah,
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. It's exposure to all the different training variables, right? Trying to just give people stimulus and exposure to all these things so that we can keep all the systems healthy.
yeah. And in doing that, you might solve some problems even though you're not targeting it, right? Like
That's
there
true.
might be enough of a reduction of threat that suddenly that nagging pain is just not an issue, or you have increased mobility in this area that you didn't before. It's the
Totally.
stubborn problems that then we have to dive deeper into the
You got it.
applied neurology approach,
I
right?
love it. Yeah. And really, the healthier the person is, the more you get away with a general approach actually solving your problems. And it happens all the time. It happens all the
Interesting. I would
time.
have thought of it, I would have thought maybe it's kind of the other way around. Like if someone's had zero exposure,
Hmm.
has never, squatted past sitting down on the couch, like that maybe there was like easy gains to be made there.
So there's easy gains to be made there. I agree. You can look at this several different ways. It sort of depends on the individual and how long has their system been
Mm,
disused,
yeah.
right? Because there's this idea of metaplasticity, which is
Hmm.
the plasticity of plasticity,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah, sure.
Yeah, and so what we're kind of seeing is that if you've been disusing certain systems for a longer period of time, okay, you actually get good at being in that state of disuse, and you don't have as much experience through exposure to go with. So someone who's been sitting on the couch for a long time, hasn't been moving, doesn't have a lot of training that's diverse, giving them that exposure, even though they may be able to go through that like honeymoon phase with training,
Hmm.
that we all love when you start strength training. And
Oh,
gosh,
I know.
I feel like I used to just look at the weights and I'd pack on muscle. Like that's how it used to be. But and that is definitely a possibility for somebody who hasn't done a lot and now they're getting into fitness. But with more targeted goals, sometimes it can actually even be harder to help that person
Right.
because they don't have as much of a framework to work off of, and they don't have as much experience with plasticity itself. So you can actually be skilled at creating plasticity just based off of your history.
That's really cool. So that just spawned like 5 questions in my brain at once. So let me try one to start. Is this kind of where we get from a functional change to a structural change, when like someone has been in the same pattern for long enough that
Mm-hmm.
it the word I want to use is calcifies, like
Mm-hmm.
those pathways sort of get entrenched and they don't want to move as quickly?
Mm. Yeah. So again, it's hard for me to know with structure, right? Because just
It's a black box.
it's a black box.
Yeah.
It is. It's a black box at this point. But yeah, it all for me is going to come down to function. And with neurons, we're essentially trying to keep them active,
Mm-hmm.
right? We're trying to keep them healthy and active. And with disuse, the opposite starts to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then with like training plasticity in and of itself, that to me is fascinating. So is the implication here, like, if someone is constantly working on new skills, and we can take this even outside of like physical skills per se, but like learning new languages and learning instruments and, you know,
Yeah.
reading the encyclopedia, I don't even know,
Yeah.
but like just constantly exposing themselves to new things, do they get better at learning?
Yes, that's absolutely. That is, I think, very well known. A lot of this also, from what I understand, came out of stroke rehabilitation research, where
Interesting.
they found that people who had strokes, the ones that had a more of a history of exposure, right, learning new things, might even take more. It might take more intensity to drive their plasticity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Versus other folks who hadn't had that experience yet, and they weren't constantly learning new things and stimulating themselves in that way. It might take less intensity, and intensity is one of the big factors that plays into plasticity.
In terms of more intense equals more plasticity
Yeah, yeah.
on
So
average?
here I'm scanning my list here, and so
Yeah.
the intensity comes very shortly here. This will tie into it. Repetition matters.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so when you're trying to create plastic change in the brain, repetition really matters, and this is super important, right? And it should make a lot of sense to people, because we know that it takes frequency
Yeah.
and repetition to create changes in, let's say, our strength.
Yeah.
Right? You can't strength train once every 2 weeks and expect great gains. You have to have enough repetition and frequency. Now, the number of repetitions is an interesting topic, and it's a difficult one because I think it's going to vary from individual to individual.
Okay.
This is, again, kind of comes full circle back to the assess reassess. So I don't know if it's possible to know how many repetitions is the perfect protocol for creating plastic change,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's different philosophies out there, and how long it takes to establish, new habits and that kind of thing. But again, I'm not totally sure. Like, I can't just put a number on it for repetition.
Yeah.
Yeah. But next comes intensity. And this is probably one of the most important factors that goes into plasticity. Intensity drives change, no doubt about it. But I'm not necessarily just talking about intensity in terms of like strenuous exercise,
Mm-hmm.
although that sometimes is part of it. I'm talking more about intensity of stimulus, right? So, for example, at the next level with all this applied neurotalk, and the Neuro Dojo is basically centered around this idea of stacking inputs together
Mm-hmm.
to achieve the goal that we're after, whether
Mm-hmm.
that's decreasing pain or improving movement. And stacking of inputs is what creates intensity,
Mm,
right? And so
okay.
this is where it gets really fun as the practitioner too, and interesting, because let's say, you have knee pain and we're doing knee circles, and it helps, but it's not solving the issue entirely. Sometimes we have to figure out how to create a more intense stimulus, and we have to bring in other systems to do that. And
Mm-hmm.
so now we might be doing some vestibular drills in combination with the knee circles, or we might be doing some visual drills, or we might be adding what we call cranial nerve stimulation, where you're doing something funny like an isometric with your tongue,
Hmm.
right? Something weird, something funny that has a purpose of activating a certain brain area with the intent of creating a stronger, more intense stimulus. This is where my career changed in terms of
Hmm.
helping people decrease pain and improve their movement, is because once I understood how to stack these different inputs together, I was able to create very, very targeted ways to achieve the goal. Right. And this is kind of the craft, right, of applied neurology, is understanding how to stack these things together.
Yeah, this is where, I'm just like, you guys are wizards, because
Right.
it's like you can kind of understand the basic concepts and maybe some of the neuroscience, but then when it comes to, okay, but how do I solve this nagging issue in this person's body?
Right.
All of a sudden it's like, I don't even know where to start, right?
Yep.
So that's pretty cool.
And it can look like magic, right? It can look,
Yeah.
and it's not. And I'm always laughing and telling people, trust me, it is not magic. Like, this is applied neuroscience, but it starts to look really woo woo and weird when you do something, like add a cranial nerve activation
Yeah.
to a movement. But there's a
The
reason.
the headphone, the in one ear thing is the one that still like tickles me. I'm just like,
Yep.
that's
Yep.
it's
And
pretty
sounds,
crazy.
yeah, sound stimulus is a huge one. And I told you about the woman that the yoga instructor, where I
Yeah.
was doing the sound
Yeah.
stimulus. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that was such a cool one, and that's pretty common. I think I also told you about recently using sound stimulus with one of our Neuro Dojo students. She started putting it into action for quite a while to help her with glute function.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
that was a good one too, and she's done amazing. She's done amazing at using the drill set that she was able to come up with through just assessing and reassessing.
Mm-hmm.
And she actually reported back not long ago in our community, and she said she went on vacation recently and she was walking long distances. And in the past, she would fall apart very quickly. And she said, I can't believe it. I got through all 2 weeks of the vacation with long distance walking and all this stuff that used to destroy her. And she said, I had no hip pain. It was crazy. I did everything that I'm never able to do. And she's like, I can't believe it. But getting back glute
Yeah.
function in this way, using these stacked inputs, has been huge.
Yeah. Because one problem tends to radiate out into other problems, right?
Yeah.
It's not just, oh, I want to perform at the highest level with being able to activate this glute. It's how it affects your vacation.
Yep.
It's yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
remember, glute bridges did not do it for her,
Mm-hmm.
right? It just was that one of those examples where she went through lots of different types of exposure with training, but because the stimulus was not specific enough for her, it wasn't sticking.
Yeah.
Right. So that's kind of, key to understand. The next one here that I have is time matters.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's tied directly to intensity, right? And it's tied directly to repetition, right? So how long are you doing, what you're doing? And so that's an important one that I'm thinking about too. But this next one is really, really important. Kind of runs my life too when I think about it.
Hmm.
Salience matters. So what I mean by that is, how important is it to you? Right? How important is it to your brain to learn this thing?
Mm-hmm.
This is, I think, well, I say it runs my life because when I think about myself, learning is my most favorite thing in life. But if I don't approach it in a way that really makes it matter to me, right? If I don't understand it at a level that then it does matter to me, I
Mhm.
just don't learn it. I choose not to. It's just like I can't keep my attention, right? I think about going through school. Learning's my most favorite thing in life, but school was my least favorite thing in life.
Yeah.
And it's just because the way that I was approaching material, with that traditional academic, that traditional academic approach was never interesting to me. And it never interested me at the level, or maybe I didn't understand things at the level that made me really pursue it.
Mhm.
And so I just chose not to. And I just I never was learning, because I have to be super excited to learn at that, at that next level. So school for me was really tough. And I think a lot of it is because of this. And I still kind of operate like this. Much of my coaching career has been based on providing people with the foundational education
Mhm.
to help them understand the why. And I feel like that really helps people create change in their health and fitness and create plasticity, because it helps them pay attention more. They understand things better.
That's so interesting because when you were saying salience, like how important it is, I was thinking like from a survival perspective, how much does your brain think you need this skill?
Right. I like that, actually, Tony. I think that we can look at it that way too.
Yeah. But what I was gonna kind of piggyback on is, like the in like yoga and stuff, sometimes they'll be like set an intention for your practice or like think about what you want out of this.
Hmm.
That there's probably some interrelatedness between what your conscious mind wants and is thinking about and then what your brain prioritizes, right?
Oh, totally. That's a great way to put it. That's a great way to put it. It's like when I was in school, it's like, learning math, right?
Yeah.
It's like nobody ever presented to me why it would be important to know it. It was just like, hey, you're here to learn this because that's what we do.
Yeah.
There was no salience to the topic. And so I was just like, I think I'll sit back here and scribble on this piece of paper and think about getting out of school early to go skateboarding.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it's just, and I think that the intention that we set with, to kind of go off of what you were saying, the intention that we set really helps us learn, right? But we have to be able to set that intention. And it's
Yeah.
really hard to set that intention if you don't know why you're doing it.
And it makes sense that you're in, applied neurology as opposed to, in a lab, because your life could have gone that way too, right?
It could
You
have.
could be doing brain scans right now and be on the
Yep.
other side of this, but
Right.
what you want to do is apply this to your life and to the lives of your clients.
I sometimes do wonder if I had experienced what neuroscience was earlier
Hmm.
on in my life, where would that have taken me?
Yeah.
But I loved movement so much, and I loved, just skill acquisition and helping people move better, and this idea of being able to move through the world efficiently in a pain-free body. Life just kind of kept pulling me more towards the movement and coaching side of things. But then to come across applied neurology later on and really dive in a practical sense of how we can kind of harness all of this amazing emerging information that's coming out is just, it's such a cool way to look at it. But it's so young
Hmm.
to even be thinking about applied neuroscience in relation to exercise. I mean, it's so young.
Yeah. And that's what's so exciting about it. I mean, it
Totally.
feels like it's new ground. At least for me, it's all brand new. Um, but yeah, I
For
had some
sure.
questions
Yeah.
kind of around some of those steps, like
Yeah.
repetition, frequency, intensity. In music, one of the techniques to learn music that I came across at a younger age and then have put into practice at various times in my life is like practice with great focus
Hmm.
for 20 minutes. No distractions, really work on something very specific. And then as soon as you start feeling like you're getting frustrated, or like instead of getting better at this repetition, you're actually starting to regress. I'm
Mm-hmm.
using your language now.
Yep.
And start making more mistakes and that kind of thing. Take a break.
Yep.
Come back to it later. And so, you hear about these kids that go to like music school and they're playing for 8 hours a day, 12 hours a day. I think they're using some of these techniques too. They're taking small breaks. And I found that sometimes I would work on something for 5 minutes and then come back the next day and suddenly be markedly better at it.
Yep.
And so I guess my question to you is, what happens in the space between doing the thing, doing the repetition, and then coming back to it later?
Yeah. That I feel is also a bit of a black box.
Yeah.
I have read some stuff that's really interesting that says a lot of the plasticity or learning, like motor patterns,
Mm-hmm.
happens in your sleep,
Mm-hmm.
which I find really fascinating. I don't know a ton about it at this point, but what I immediately thought about with what you said is similarly, especially when I'm helping people with drills to get them out of pain
Mm-hmm.
and we're trying to reduce threat. A lot of times people do best with high frequency of small doses,
Mm.
right? So that kind of is what we're trying to achieve with this threat reduction phase. You have some pain, we create a drill set, maybe a stack of inputs, one of our voodoo drills, right? Using our applied neuro drills. Oftentimes what I will kind of prescribe to the client is to maybe practice that drill 5-6 times in a day, but
Mm-hmm.
that practice is only going to be 45 seconds to 2 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And what they're essentially doing is creating the activation without fatiguing the system. And they're going to do it with enough repetition, enough time, and enough intensity in the moment, as we talked about, to try to drive this change. So this is where the kind of the art of the whole thing comes
Mm-hmm.
into play. Because in the end, no matter how much people want to believe it, there is no such thing as a protocol.
Hmm.
It's just protocols are good for sales, right? And so like I could be creating mobility protocols for people and selling them,
Mm-hmm.
but I choose not to because of what I know. And what I know tells me that there's no such thing as protocols because everybody seems to respond differently to all the given inputs, and their minimal effective dose is different.
Right.
And so we choose to kind of build our business around the education that we understand, where we're trying to empower people to learn this material so that they can assess it and see how their body responds, and then apply it with, in the ways that we've had the most success with, but give them the educational foundation to make smarter decisions as they go, because everybody seems to respond somewhat differently. So all of this comes down to finding the minimal effective dose. And like you were talking about, we've seen people do really, really well with multiple sets, done throughout a whole day,
Mm-hmm.
right? And to reduce threat and improve their performance without fatiguing out the system. Now everybody's different. So like you mentioned some of these musicians that might play for hours and hours and hours.
Oh, they're the outliers for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. And the thing is, that can work. There are individuals that if you drive a ton of intensity,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's amazing how, especially with the human brain, one repetition done extremely intense can actually change things drastically. And if you actually think about this in terms of like, I don't know, what can we call it? Like having a phobia
Mm-hmm.
of something. Like let's say you're afraid of water. Okay. You're afraid to go swimming because when you were little, you fell off the dock into the lake and, you almost drowned. Someone had to pull you out. And you had one repetition of an extremely intense event in your life. And that created change for you in these different ways. And now you have a fear of water, and that's just something that's you're constantly battling with.
Mm-hmm.
So one repetition of something that's super intense can actually change us drastically. And when we're talking about like skill acquisition, there are people that actually do incredibly well with very intense practice.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the but. And this actually is the last thing on the list.
Love it.
Yeah, metabolism matters, which brings us to fuel. Okay, so if you have fuel problems, okay, your body is not utilizing energy efficiently, or the energy isn't there because maybe you're not fueling yourself appropriately or frequently enough, you cannot expect the same plastic change. Because as we mentioned, the brain is an energy hog and it's constantly calculating energy demand. And if the energy isn't there, it will not let you get better
Mm-hmm.
because it's not in your best interest from a survival perspective. So for individuals that have thyroid issues and blood sugar issues, things of that nature, some sort of metabolic dysregulation, plasticity is harder. It's much harder because you have an energy utilization issue. So we have to look for ways to support people with fuel in the training process. And now I feel like this is either the elephant in the room or almost no one knows about it. I'm not sure which one it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know that people, coaches and movement practitioners and therapists and doctors, if you're good at what you do, you're observing this.
Mm-hmm.
You're observing this. You're observing people who are constantly looking for ways to get out of pain, constantly trying to improve movement, and they're trying all these different things. And sometimes they provide relief or results, but then that relief and those results don't stick.
Mm-hmm.
If you're good at what you do, you see this happening. If you're not yet experienced enough in what you do, you don't see it happening, and you are kind of falling into the, I'm going to throw everything at it, and see what happens. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail kind of approach.
Yep.
So, and that's where I was like early on before kind of knowing all this stuff is I was observing that there were, well, to be honest with you, most people who are out there looking for a pain solution fall into this category because they're also telling you, hey, I've tried everything. Why isn't everything working? Or, sometimes I find that one thing that helps and then shortly after it doesn't anymore.
Mm-hmm. Those
are fuel issue people. I know we've talked about this several times now on the podcast. This conversation will never go away.
Yeah.
It's such an important one. The point here being, if the fuel's not there, your brain will essentially calculate that it doesn't have what it needs, and driving that functional change at the brain level will become extremely difficult. So what do? Number one, we incorporate breathing exercises into a person's practice, usually combined with the actual drilling, because if you do the right breathing exercises, it's the fastest way to support someone at the fuel level.
Mm-hmm.
So that's like the first thing. Nutritional habits are going to be huge. Okay. And even eventually improving someone's aerobic fitness is a very important fuel-based strategy, but sometimes it's not the best one right away if a person is super compromised because it takes energy. But doing breathing drills are going to be maybe less energy expensive and a great way to provide fuel support. So I think so many people are going around trying multiple different interventions, seeing different doctors. Nobody can actually understand why you're not getting the results that you want. Most people who contact me say to me, I've seen, 5 doctors.
I've tried everything.
I've tried everything. The 5 doctors kind of throw their hands up in the air at this point. They don't know why I'm still in pain. Maybe I have this one intervention that helped me temporarily, but the results never stick. Most people who are reaching out to me are those people. And most of the time, it's somehow fuel is at play here. And actually, it made me think of a great recent story. I was doing a one-on-one recently with a member in our community, and she had a history of chronic pain issues, and there was some hip pain, some wrist pain. One of the things that was kind of making her nervous right now is she was having a lot of significant balance issues, and she wasn't, she's not at an age where she should be sensing her own balance problems, right? To the level that she was. It was like really making her nervous.
Yeah.
And I took her through a whole battery of assessments just on a one-on-one call. And we started testing her cerebellar function. And so the cerebellum is a brain area that is very much tied to our movement ABCs: accuracy, balance, coordination. And we do a number of different assessments that are essentially rapid movements done for time. So as simple as like quickly tapping your hand on your palm, right? Or, your index finger to the tip of your thumb, like how fast can you do it? And we assess side to side, right versus left. And we look at performance. I usually test people for like roughly 6 seconds, right? Tapping your foot on the ground. We have one where you take your hand, you use it as a target. You hit your palm with your other hand, and then you turn your hand over and you hit your knuckles. And so you do this really fast motion where it's palm, knuckles, palm, knuckles.
Fish.
You got it. Yeah, it's a floppy fish in your hand. And we compare side to side. How fast can you do it? How rhythmic is it? Right? Does your coordination fall apart? And we can quickly tease out which side of the body is more coordinated than the other. And when we do this, we then kind of fit you into what we call a cerebellar pattern. So if you're less coordinated on the left side of your body, you're a left cerebellar pattern. If you're less coordinated on the right, you're a right cerebellar pattern. If you happen to be split, you might be a left upper body cerebellar pattern and a right lower body cerebellar pattern. That's possible too. And so it's a really fast way.
Does this tend to track with a dominant hand?
You see it a lot, but surprising to people. It's very surprising to people when the tests show something different. So like for me, I am a righty with pretty much everything. But when my health is compromised to some degree, I happen to be a right-sided lower body cerebellar pattern. So if my immune system is overloaded, if I am stressed out for a long period of time, I'm not fueled properly, whatever the case might be, maybe I'm not recovered from training, sometimes I will be a right cerebellar pattern, even though I'm right side dominant. So it can change. So working with this lady, I went through the cerebellar tests with her, and it was very, very clear that she was what we call a bilateral cerebellum, where both sides of the body were expressing slow and dysrhythmic coordination. And that points all arrows back to the midline. So we start thinking about, is this problem coming from the spine? Is it coming from her eyes? Is it coming from her inner ear? Right? Those are the first things we start to think about when we see bilateral findings. And she was having a lot of balance issues, and her coordination was really lousy. Like her tests were falling apart in 2 or 3 seconds. She was losing accuracy and rhythm, and that movement would become flippery looking. The lower body ones, when she was tapping her foot, she became incredibly unstable in her midline. So as she was tapping her foot, she was kind of bobbling around because her spine wasn't stable just from the action of tapping her foot. So I was immediately starting to see, okay, we have definitely a pretty significant cerebellar issue on our hands for this relatively healthy individual. And now I'm starting to see the balance issues too. I did something called a Romberg's assessment with her, where you stand in a nice long posture, feet together so that you have a narrow base, and you instruct the person to close their eyes and just balance there. And I look for maybe 15, 20 seconds, and I kind of see if she's swaying at all, right? Because there'll be some level of like micro sway as your body's trying to orient itself and maintain posture and balance without the use of the visual system. because we close the eyes. We changed the stance into a tandem stance. That's as if you're standing on a line. So it's more narrow. It becomes more challenging. She would close her eyes and fall out of position within 2 seconds. And that's not okay. So I immediately was like, okay, I understand why she's scared right now about her balance. So took the history, did the assessments, started to see that this is a bilateral issue and whole body issue, upper body, lower body, poor assessments, balance, poor assessments. Took a history, started to learn some things about her. One of the things was long-standing eating disorder. Okay, so we already know long-standing fuel issue to some degree. And I started to piece it together, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to test her breathing because I wonder if she has some dysfunctional breathing patterns. So, because when you see bilateral poor cerebellar function, you have to immediately think about fuel. Because what's more normal is to see that somebody is more or less coordinated on one side of the body.
Right.
When you start to see it on both to this level, it makes you think about some other higher order systems. Yeah. Yes. So I tested her breathing. We have an assessment that, again, we teach all these assessments in the Neuro Dojo. One is called a functional inhale. The other is called a functional exhale. The idea behind the assessment is through your nose, how long can you inhale once for? So you basically are very slowly pulling in this inhale, this little trickle of an inhale through your nose. And on the other end, I'm the coach timing you to see how long you can inhale for. And then we do the same thing with an exhale. So you take a big breath through your nose, you trickle out this exhale for as long as possible, just one rep, and we time it. So the standard that we like to see is that a person is able to do this for roughly 30 seconds. The athletic standard is higher than that. But at first, if you're 30 seconds-ish or greater, fantastic. We're not as concerned about fuel in terms of breathing. Well, hers was 6 seconds.
Wow. Okay.
So she was not able to inhale or exhale for longer than 6 seconds. And then I started to ask her about her breathing. We went back to her history. She said for her whole life she's had asthma. Okay, got it.
Fuel issue.
Issue there, more related to breathing. And then she said she actually just notices that she's not able to inhale very well, right? She goes for a walk. Maybe she's starting to go up a hill or does a flight of stairs. Her heart rate starts to become elevated. She needs to breathe more. She just notices that her breathing is very shallow. And I think what she was kind of describing to me is that there was some air hunger attached to it that was uncomfortable when it shouldn't be. So now I'm starting to see the big picture. I'm like, oh, I wonder if this cerebellar issue that I'm seeing and this balance issue is literally all because she's getting no fuel that she needs for these systems to be healthy and function well. So we went to a breathing drill. I taught her one thing after a long history and a whole battery of assessments. The drill is called bag breathing. This is so bizarre. To this day, this is just still one of those drills that when it works like this, I just throw my arms up in the air and I'm like, this is bizarre. If anybody saw this. So I had her get a plastic bag from the kitchen. So like a 1-gallon plastic bag. And everyone always looks at me like I'm crazy when I give them the instructions for this. But I had them take the bag and put it over her mouth and her nose. And the idea is you seal it with your hands. So now you've got this 1-gallon bag in front of your face. And I say, okay, I want you to breathe into the bag. In through your nose, out through pursed lips, kind of like you're blowing out a birthday candle. It could be in through the nose, out through the nose too. Either one is fine. And you do it slowly, right? You don't want to like hyperventilate in the bag. And I watch them, right? And just kind of keep reminding them as they're doing this, they're breathing into the bag. Keep it slow, keep it relaxed. Try not to build unwanted tension in your body. And you have them do this for roughly 30 to 40 seconds. And then usually what happens is each bout that you do is a little bit less and less in duration, because
Mhm.
as you become more air hungry, essentially, the bouts get shorter just naturally. What we're doing is rebreathing our own CO2,
Right. So
right?
there's less
So,
and less oxygen, more and more
yes.
CO2. Yeah.
And we'll get to that in a minute because it's super counterintuitive for someone that's not up to speed yet on gas exchange with breathing. But here's the cool part of the story. We did one bout of 40 seconds of bag breathing, and then I had her immediately retest with the cerebellar drills and the balance drills. She aced her cerebellar tests. Upper and lower body coordination was clean, and it was the same for the 6-second test. Then I had her go back to the Romberg's test with her balance, and
Mhm.
rather than having extreme sway and falling out of position, she stood there like a statue.
Hmm.
I mean, it was insane. She opened her eyes after the Romberg's test, this huge grin on her face. She was like, wow. Now,
Yeah.
remember, this is also, I don't know if I said this in the history taking, but she's one of those people that said, I've tried lots of different things. Nothing really seems to work, and she was saying how she had actually worked on her nutritional habits in the last 3 years. She'd come a long way.
Mhm.
And her nutrition was a lot better, and that had helped her to some degree,
Mhm.
but things just weren't sticking. And the reason she actually ended up contacting me is because she started doing our programs. Remember, we said in the dojo, things are more generalized.
Mhm.
She liked the exercises and she was getting some benefit, but she would find that she wasn't recovering well from the training.
Mhm.
And then that would set her back a little bit. And then she wasn't able to do as much training as she wanted to. And that pattern persisted until eventually she was like, should I give up on the strength training? I know I need it, but my
Right.
body's not tolerating it. And the reason she wasn't tolerating doing the strength training is because she had a massive fuel issue and her brain didn't want her to do it anymore because it
Mhm.
was too energy costly. So she smoked those assessments after one bout of bag breathing. So we did a few other bouts. And then I explained to her how we were going to use that. Going back to our variables that come into play with plasticity, now we were talking about how can we give her the minimal effective dose of this one breathing drill
Right.
to start to fuel her properly, right? And create some plasticity. We haven't done any other training besides that yet, but this idea of starting with a breathing exercise becomes foundational because of that last variable that we talked about where metabolism matters.
Mhm.
So now we have to go after better metabolic health and better fuel capacity before doing the other things matters. Otherwise, even if we get the right exercises and we piece them together in a way that does what we want it to do functionally in the moment, we won't be able to expect any long-term change because the fuel's not there.
Yeah. So, I mean, you don't have to give us the whole training program that you guys built, but is the idea that then she would use bag breathing before she would do strength training or in between sets at some points
You got
or
it. Yeah,
okay.
yeah, that's exactly it. So what I encouraged her to do is I said, all right, let's hold off on the strength training right now because it's
Mhm.
going to be very energy costly. Let's go back to the mobility program where we're just doing joint mobilizations. And she said she had actually had some improvements with doing some of the midline mobility work like thoracic glides, lumbar circles. These are all mobility drills for the spine that she said
Mhm.
were helping her feel better. And she was really liking them. I said, let's go back to the mobility program. And now you're going to bag breathe as your warm up. You're going to bag breathe between drills,
Mhm.
right? And you're going to do this throughout the duration of your practice. And then you can also use bag breathing during your day because she's sitting at the desk looking at the computer a lot. That's very energy expensive.
Mhm.
I instructed her, you use bag breathing as you need it, lean on it for that boost. Because when we did the bag breathing, one of the amazing things that I saw with her is that her coloration changed
Hmm.
after 2 bouts of bag breathing, because when we increase CO2, we increase circulation to the body's tissues. Because without the CO2, we can't drive blood to everywhere it needs to go. So it becomes really counterintuitive because
Yeah.
everyone's like, oh, CO2, you don't want CO2, you want oxygen. But if you are a dysfunctional breather and you've been mouth breathing for a very long time, like she had been, basically she's blowing off and hyperventilating, right? This is kind of like a low grade hyperventilation that people will fall into over time when their system is really stressed out and they don't have fuel. It's not necessarily something the average person can notice, but when you assess their breathing and you kind of get a sense for what their rate of respiration is, somebody might be in kind of this low grade hyperventilation throughout the day. And then they take those poor habits into their sleep. And now they're doing the same thing and they're breathing through their mouth.
Mm-hmm.
She actually said that she would catch herself mouth breathing even while just being outside walking.
Did you try the mouth tape while she slept?
So we haven't got there yet. And that's something we might do, right?
Yeah.
That's something we might do. So I instructed her to use the bag breathing throughout her training and her day and to lean on it because it really was helpful for improving circulation, making her more alert and improving her movement. So we're doing that for a little bit. And then we're going to start incorporating a bit more training and getting a bit more targeted with the approach to more specifically go after her pain goals.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's kind of the most important thing now because if you're in pain, people love to get motivated to do whatever it is that they want to do because they feel pain.
Yeah.
But then what happens is you dive in and eventually you might feel good initially, but then eventually you hit roadblocks because now the pain is preventing you from moving forward. So we're trying to get some control over that first before we can take on too much of the other strength training.
Yeah. That's awesome. And you're going to assess and reassess and make sure that this is still, the bag breathing is still having a positive effect.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And we're going to take on more breathing drills because bag breathing itself will not change dysfunctional breathing patterns that are long standing.
Right.
I don't like to use this word. You might already know that. It's a little bit of a hack because it doesn't come with the re-education of better breathing mechanics. So
this will not contribute to the plasticity of your breathing, right?
Right.
This is just like an aid in real time. Yeah.
Yeah, it's sometimes a really good first step because it allows a person to build up CO2 really fast, and CO2 is required for so many processes in the body. It's a great stepping stone into breath training, which is definitely going to be the primary focus of the work I do with her.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be working on better breathing mechanics with all of our great breathing drills, working on mobility of the rib cage, our famous diaphragm stretch, right? All of these things, possibly some other CO2 based breathing drills, for sure. Other CO2 based breathing drills where we're working on building a tolerance to air hunger, improving the CO2 tolerance. All that stuff is going to be quite useful in helping to rebalance the chemistry of her body through better breathing habits. That will help her with the part of the fuel problem that was missing because she had already worked really diligently and hard over a number of years to come back from being the person that had an eating disorder to now changing her nutritional habits for the better very consistently. The problem is the breathing was missing.
Yeah. Yeah, we did an early episode on breathing. I would love to revisit that topic.
Yeah.
Maybe when she's further along, since this is kind of a really great case study, to think about how fuel can affect someone so dramatically, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Any last thoughts on neuroplasticity?
Yeah. Be careful what you practice because plasticity can also go wrong.
Yeah.
Right. So keep that in the back of your mind and understand that exposure to a variety of training stimuli is what's most important for keeping these many systems healthy. So don't get boxed in to one methodology or one kind of training because the way that I see it is if let's say you're only strength training You're just working on your muscles. You're just working on moving the weight. Remember, there is disuse happening at the same time. As weird as that may sound, there's lots of different parts of the sensory system that is not getting adequate activation because these neurons that we're talking about require very specific inputs in order to stay healthy and active. So you don't want to get boxed into training any one specific way. And if you're looking to target things, pain issues, mobility issues, whatever it might be, you now have to start thinking about this idea of plasticity and how to become more targeted in your approach. If you're a coach or a movement professional therapist, somebody who's helping your clients with these goals, you now have to start thinking about the whole system, all these different parts of it, all these different sensory systems that we discuss. And well, if you want to learn how to stack the inputs together, that's what we teach inside the Neuro Dojo. We teach you about all these brain areas. We teach you all the tools that we have for activating those areas. We teach you the assess-reassess process, and we teach you how to construct the exact stimulus that is needed to help that individual with their goal. And that's, all the stories I've shared in the last, handful of episodes with individuals that had tried all these different things and nothing was helping, but then a certain stacked input practiced under the umbrella of all these variables that we discussed today, like time and repetition and intensity. And of course, the education's there for the salience. All of that matters. And that's what we do inside our Neuro Dojo course.
Yeah. Awesome stuff.
All right. There it is, Tony. A little bit about neuroplasticity. It's actually a huge topic. We only grazed, the surface here, but I'm sure we'll be back to talk about this. Remember, the main takeaway here is that you can change your brain function. You can do it. You just have to use the right targeted approach. If you want to learn more about how to be targeted with that approach, make sure to check out our free webinar coming up on applied neurology. You can join us on August 21st. If you can't make that live component, don't worry about it. As long as you're signed up, you will still have access. After that takes place, we'll be starting our sales process for the Neuro Dojo. Whether you are a fitness enthusiast on a lifelong journey to bettering your health and your fitness, or a movement practitioner of some kind, you're going to love the Neuro Dojo because it's going to teach you everything that you need to know to target these different issues that we're constantly talking about, like pain issues, mobility issues. You'll learn it all. So I really, really hope that you consider signing up for the course. And remember, do not miss the webinar because it is mind-blowing. That's it for today. Remember, hop on over, give us a 5-star review. Thank you, everybody, for your support. I really feel like the podcast is taking shape really nicely now. And thank you, Tony. Head on over, give us that review. That's going to be great for us. And it's just an awesome way for us to reach more people and help more people like you. See you next time. Oh, I said see you again. I'm such a video guy.